Own a fish painting. Wow. My best to your husband.
Shalom, friends. Thank you so much for being here. Great to see you, those who are live and those who in the Zoom and those who are on the live stream. We are thrilled today to learn about this very rich topic with Rabbi Hyim Shafner, who is the rabbi of Kesher Israel, the Georgetown Synagogue in Washington, D.C. Previously, he served as rabbi of Base Abraham Congregation in St. Louis, Missouri, as rabbi of the Hillel at Washington University in St. Louis, and as the rabbi of India for the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. He has rabbinical ordination, an MSW in social work, and an MA in Jewish philosophy from Yeshiva University, and trained as a psychotherapist at the St. Louis Psychoanalytic Institute. Rabbi Shafner is the author of the Everything Jewish Wedding book and has published widely in an array of Jewish journals, periodicals, and books. Rav Hyim, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you. Thank you. Boy, they'll read anything you give them. No, I'm kidding. Thank you. No, it's really, it's a pleasure to be here. I have watched through the Tzedek. I don't know if I've taught for you before, but I've certainly watched from afar, had lots of rabbinic interns who've been involved. And of course, seen how Reb Shmuley has made an enormous impact on the world and on the environment. The topic today, let me share my screen with you and I'll share a link. Here's a link to the text. And I'll also share my screen with you. And this actually, I came across kind of, I don't want to say by accident, but I don't know. I was like, I grew up with Mussar. I grew up in a lot of Haredi yeshivas, and so we used to learn Mussar. But Mussar was always the classic Mussar books. It was what one might call early to middle Mussar. It was Mesilas Yesharim, it was Orchos Tzadikim. You read Orchos Tzadikim, but some of it's pretty hard hitting. If you, did a sin, you should fast for 40 days. He says that in many places. And there's a lot of wonderful things in all of those books. But what I hadn't really been exposed to, when I had been in Mussar yeshivas, was sort of later Mussar. And later Mussar, of course, is much more about Gadlut Adam, the greatness of the human being. And the Alter von Slobodka is, of course, a well-known figure in the Mussar movement, Rabbi Nosson Tzvi Finkel. And so I was, I just started to sort of look at some of it. And I can't remember if this is the first piece I looked at, but I read it and I was just so shocked at what was there, because not only was it sort of, extremely modern in the thinking, and I first came across it a couple of years ago in kind of the midst of a Black Lives Matter movement. And when I read this, I was like, wow, that's what he's talking about. And, whatever one's politics is, he talks about things that one does not expect to come out of classical Torah thought. And so I found it to be relevant in a few ways. Number one, it was very much relevant to my work as a psychotherapist, because what he's talking about a lot is the unconscious. And actually, I talked about this a little bit at a conference at GW on Judaism and psychotherapy, and this relates a little bit to, I think, the question of to what extent was Freud and the notions of the unconscious. Maybe we imagine that everybody who has an idea about the unconscious gets it from Freud, but it may have worked the other way. There's a lot of evidence that Freud had a tremendous amount of exposure to Judaism, much more than we realize, much more than he was willing to admit. And you'll see some of that here. And also a sense of what is our responsibility to others. What is our response? We talk a lot in Orthodoxy, especially, about what our responsibility is to other Jews who are like us. So first of all, there's the question of what's our responsibility to Jews who are not like us? And what's our responsibility to people who are not Jews? And you'll see very quickly in the writings of Rabbi Nosson Tzvi Finkel that he sees it in an extremely wide way. So what I'll do is I've chosen 3 paragraphs and I'll kind of read them to you in Hebrew. There is no translation. I translated the first paragraph on my own, and you'll see it's right here under where it says Aretz Safun. And the second paragraph is really a Gemara that he's quoting, which is a little bit further down on the page from Bava Metzia. Some of you may recognize. And so let's do the text, and then we'll look at some things that are relevant to it. I feel like it speaks there's an idea, the most central idea of Levinas, I think, is really resonates very much with what the Alter says. And then we'll look a little bit at something from Thich Nhat Hanh that I think relates to it also. Okay, so he says, this piece is called, there's not that many pieces of Mussar, I think. Maybe there's more from the Alter, but it's not that much that I found. There's enough for a thin book. But this is on the question of chesed. And the fundamental question he's going to ask is, why does the Torah have to tell us to do chesed? All of the things that are involved in the Torah's chesed, whether that's helping the donkey of your enemy, whether that is returning lost objects, whether that is caring for the widow and the orphan, whatever it is, lending money. Why does it have to tell you that? Wouldn't you know that from your own conscience? Yeah, that's interesting, because a lot of times in Judaism, we often think, oh, there is no morality without Torah. But the Alter seems to take for granted that we could certainly have morality without having the Torah. Besides, obviously, the Chazal say you could learn it from the animals. So he says, Mida zu shel chesed, this concept of chesed, this characteristic of chesed. He says, you would know it from your intellect, even without the Torah commanding it to you. The human being has a sense of conscience, hopefully. So why does the Torah have to command you all these things about chesed, about kindness? He says the chesed that the Torah is commanding us is totally different than the chesed we would know from our own conscience and our own thinking. Because every person is obligated to feel the pain of the other, of their friend, of another person. In Yav Chalishuto, the person's downtroddenness, their weakness, and to work to make it better for them. To resolve, to elevate, to alleviate some of their pain. Lashiro, to make them wealthy, right? To take away their poverty. And to strengthen them. He says that's the general obligation that our conscience would give us, right? That seems obvious then. So what does the Torah command you above and beyond that? The Torah is commanding us that that's not enough. This is shocking. He says you have to feel the pain of the other, which they themselves cannot feel. Why can't they feel it? Or why do they have it? Right? If they hurt their arm, they'll feel that. But there's other kinds of pain that they have and they don't know they have, that they feel and they don't know they feel, but they feel it. Where'd they get it? Because of their situation, their specific, either their individual situation, their nurture, their individual situation they've been exposed to, or mehashpas hamatzav haklali shel svivato, or because of the impact of the atmosphere that they have been brought up in. And we have an obligation to do good to them, even with regard to that. Because deep within them, right? If it's a place that they don't know, it's obviously they're unconscious, but it's real. But omek omko shalibo, in the depths of their hearts, yesh yesod lahargashas chisaron zeh, they do feel it. That's what he says. There's a fundamental sense that they do feel it, even though they don't feel it consciously. If they become free from the bonds of the way that they assume things to be, of the way that they've been raised, the ways that they've been living, or from the intergenerational trauma that they have received. Me'ashpas hatzarot v'hasevel shekol imochai bahem ze me'ot shanim. The intergenerational pain that they have received from hundreds of years. It's unbelievable, right? He's writing this in the late 19th century. Like, who's he writing about? I was reading this 2-3 years ago and I was like, oh my gosh, is he writing about is he on that, is he on one side of the Black Lives Matter movement? Is that what's happening here? It's wild. Hargasha amuka kazu mechayevas Torah. This depth of feeling, the Torah obligates us to tune into. Kol ish Yisrael chayev lahargish. Every Jew is obligated to feel this pain in others. Ulishtada lahetiv lechavero lefi hamida shu mechayeves, and to work hard to do good to others according to how much they need. Gam hargashot eila chelek ma'chaim hema. Because these feelings, even these feelings that are so unconscious, these painful feelings are part of life. They're part of their life. They're real. And a person does feel them in the depths of their soul, and they want to address them. Even though they don't know they feel the pain, they do feel the pain, and they want to address it. So let me at least just sort of open it up for a moment. What's your, any thoughts, any questions? This is sort of, to me, this is shocking that he's able to even think about such a thing. Yeah, Mona.
So this is indeed amazing. I have several thoughts. One is, aside from calling it the unconscious, we know that people who have been traumatized carry their memories in their bodies, and that's a lot of Bessel van der Kolk's work.
Yeah.
The body keeps the score. So that, to me, that's what this partly reminds me of. Also, the intergenerational transmission of trauma, the intergenerational transmission of epigenetic changes due to trauma and stress. And also, there's something about empathy. The neurobiology of empathy shows that it's the first step of empathy is that we feel in our body what the other person is feeling in their body, even before we name it. Which, again, this seems to be reflecting that. It's quite remarkable.
Yeah, they talk about that a lot in interpersonal psychology, in which your feelings in the world of psychotherapy, your feelings as a therapist actually have started now in a lot of literature to count more in a certain sense than the feelings of the patient, because obviously you have to know that it's not just your feelings, but that what you feel is when two people are together, I think is what you're referring to, when two people are together, there's some kind of there's some way that people mirror each other, right? This sort of mirroring gene or neuron, and what when right. So that's interesting, right? In other words, maybe because that's gonna be part of the question here is first of all, how do I do this? How do I access this? And what do I do? Let's say that I could feel the other's unconscious pain. How do I even address that? What do I do? I mean, it's because they're not. Assuming that I can actually have the ability to tune into this, which I don't know if we really can. I mean, he thinks we can. He thinks not only that, he thinks we're obligated to. That's interesting.
I just want to add one more thing, which is it's really important in talking about this that we have humility, because I may assume I know what you're feeling because of what I'm feeling, but there may be a cultural gap, there may be an interpersonal gap. So I want to throw in a dose of humility.
That's true. That's true. Right. In other words, and I think a lot of times we do hold back from getting involved, especially when there's race involved, because we're like, well, I don't want to run the risk of, being the white knight. And but of course you can err on the on that side too, in which you don't get involved. Okay, let's read a little bit more. It says, Ita Bamitzia. So he quotes Gemara Bamitzia that you may be familiar with. Ma'aser Rabbi Yochanan ben Matya, she'amar lo. You also wonder, by the way, to what extent is he talking about Jewish pain? What is, I mean, if, it's interesting, right? We don't talk that much. I mean, we do now post-Holocaust, but, is the pain of our long history of persecution, how does that impact us? The story in Bava Metzia is, here it's talking about what you have to pay your workers. So how do you know how much you have to pay your workers? In terms of, and it used to be that people would get hired for a day, and as part of that, there would be there were day laborers, and so you would provide for them a salary, but also a meal. And the question is, if it's part of the salary situation, there's some obligation to what the meal has to include. So he says to his son, go and hire day workers. He went and he hired the workers, and he said, and there is a place where the Gemara there says, whatever the custom is, that's what you supply for them. And that should be the obvious sort of Nizikin, the obvious answer when it comes to monetary law. But he goes a step further, Rabbi Yochanan. He says, when the son came, he said, B'ni, my son, it turns out he hired them and he didn't specify what kind of meal he was going to give them. Maybe the son thought he'd give them a regular meal. And he says, no, if you didn't specify, you have an unlimited obligation to them. Even if you'll give them the biggest meal in the world, like King Solomon, you will not have fulfilled your obligation. Why not? Now, you would think that his answer would be a kind of monetary answer. Well, why not? Because they can say, oh, we think you promised us something greater. Now, the truth is they can't really, because whatever the normative custom is going to be what's assumed. Assumptions are made in torts and in monetary law. But he says something different here. He says, Shem b'nei Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov. Look at their lineage. Look at who they are. Now, does that mean that Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were so great, so we owe them something? Does that mean they're our brethren? What does that mean? It's an interesting question. So he says, rather, you better go and you better specify what we're going to pay them, or you're going to break the bank. Say to them, I'm hiring you, that I'm only obligated to give you bread and lentils. I guess that was a normal meal. Now, these are workers who have never been wealthy. They're poor, the children of poor people. They're not used to being wealthy. They'd be happy with bread and water. So the Alter's asking, he's saying, what are you talking about? They don't expect anything. They expect bread and water. It's all they're used to. You're telling me that you have an obligation to them, that you have to feed them like Solomon would feed them? He says, yes, they are doresh something. It's fascinating, his choice of word. I don't know if he read, I think Levinas is after him. But doresh means right, like a drasha. A drasha means you derive one thing from another, right? People are doresh tzion. We seek out. Drisha, who they are, creates an obligation, an ethical obligation. It seeks something. It creates a requirement. How much of a requirement? Enormous. It's infinite. The obligation that the other, that I have, the given obligation that I have to the other, qua other, that they're doresh mimeni, their presence, their face, as it were, requires of me, draws from me, is doresh from me, seeks out from, obligates me in, is unlimited. Because they're the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? They themselves are used to nothing. But everyone has a father and a mother. Everyone has grandparents. Everyone comes from somewhere. Everyone is a human being. Hyim Yodeya, now maybe he's talking only about Jews here, I don't know. Hyim Yodeya hu hapoel midrishas nafshazos. Does this worker have any idea what we're even talking about here? The worker will be happy with bread and water. Lo v'lo. Marchik gadol mavdil beino v'nidiat argashazu. This worker has no idea that he himself is doresh, that his presence creates a sense of obligation that's unlimited. Avalatoa margeshes ota ad omka v'omeret alav shesuda shama ena nikram zamasetzlo. The Torah feels it. Very interesting turn of phrase. The Torah feels his sense of drisha, of how his being calls out in ethical obligation to us. That's unlimited, it's infinite. Even though he can't feel it at all. He has no idea. He would be thrilled if he gave him bread and water. So therefore, if the child of Rabbi Yochanan had said had not said what he's going to give them, so then he would have to say, listen, here's all I'm going to give you. Now, this is not a monetary thing, right? On a monetary level, of course, the Gemara says, whatever the custom is to give workers, that's what you're obligated because of. No obligation qua money. There's no Nezikin obligation here to, in the world of torts and damages, to pay more than what's normal. There's some other obligation going on here, right? And that, let me just skip down here to just a line from Levinas, because it just so pops out. right? Levinas's famous idea about the face opens the primordial discourse, whose first word is obligation, right? Levinas had this idea that just another human being, a human being is such, I mean, it's similar to the idea of the human being made in the image of God, but that just the presence of the human being creates an ethical obligation on others. Well, that's interesting because, we're used to walking through an airport and it's just a conglomeration of faces, right? But the face is what is metaphorically represents somehow the uniqueness of the human. The fact that every human being is unique creates a sense of moral obligation, not just monetary obligation. And that's what he's saying here. He's saying here, yes, in the world of Talmud, we have monetary obligations. But Rabbi Yochanan is making an interesting move here, where he's taking this sort of very modern ethical sensibility and saying, you can actually conflate that with real monetary obligation, which is very surprising because is he serious? Is he not serious? Would he, if you said to him, are you really obligated? Is this a din? Is this a law in damages and in business law? Is this shulchan? It's there's a conflation of ideas here that he's bringing together, kind of ethics with law. But he does seem to be bridging that. I mean, it's a radical thing, but he seems to be bringing it into Gemara. It's not the Gemara's bottom line, but Rabbi Yochanan ben Matya seemed to think that Choshen Mishpat and ethics are not necessarily separable, at least in this case. Okay, let me do the third paragraph. The Gemara says, it says Abraham's meal actually was greater than Shlomo's, right? The phrase Sudas Shlomo B'Shata, the meal of Solomon in its day, is always a turn of phrase that means, the epitome of the royal meal. But he says, the Alter says, actually, Abraham did more than Shlomo. The Gemara says that Abraham made 3 animals, one for each of the guests. As there was a great rabbi in St. Louis, Rabbi Abraham McGancy, who Phil will remember, and he was a great tzaddik from Europe, from the Grodin Yeshiva. He was the rabbi of Beis Abraham before I became the rabbi there. And he used to emphasize, he said, when Abraham saw those 3 people walking in the desert, not only did he not know they're angels, he said they weren't Jews, they weren't monotheists. Abraham was the only monotheist. They were polytheists. They were idolaters. That's who Abraham left God's presence to go and welcome. Right? That's so. And what does he do? He doesn't just welcome them. He makes this incredible meal in the eyes of the Gemara. So the Gemara says, how do you know what he made them? So the Gemara says, well, he obviously would have made them the best food there is. What's the best food? So Gemara says it's tongue in mustard. I guess it's where Jews get the deli idea from. I don't know, but I don't know if I agree with this. But the Gemara says he must have made 3. The Gemara is interested in how many animals did Abraham make. So Gemara, it must be 3 because he must have given them a tongue in mustard. So Ham said oneg kazet he totza yishara me'omek histaklus b'nefesh. Why is Abraham doing this? Right, the Alter is bothered by why does Abraham go this far according to the Gemara. So he says that's it's not the ceiling, that's the floor, right? Because he says, well, how does Abraham know this? Abraham had an ability to see the depths of people's souls. And if you can see the depths of a person's soul, even if they're not hungry, what are you seeing? Right? It doesn't mean the angels were in pain. What does he see in the depths of their soul? Humanness. Humanness begs something of us. It requires something of us. How much? Infinite. Nefesh zu shenichtzeva mishmei maram. This soul which came from on high. The soul is made in the image of God. And kates la'ashiruta, there is no end to its value. Va'omek drishata, and the depths of its drisha, the depths of its drisha is such a good word. I have a hard time translating it into English. Right? It inquires and requires of me.
Would
it
a claim, would that work?
yeah, that's pretty good. Yeah, it has a claim. The person's soul and presence as a human has a claim on me, an ethical claim. Yeah, nefesh zish because it comes from above. Therefore, we can't even figure out the limits. We have to find the depths of the depths and reveal them. This is fascinating. We have an obligation to shake off the thick dust shenitzbar alav that has accumulated on that person, on others, hashonim, from the different situations a person has experienced. Bashpat chaye hafshatot v'hagasot shel hasviva asher chai b'tocha. Everybody lives through situations. If you've lived through situations that are difficult, if you've lived in a world that impacts you negatively, there's this dust that accumulates on you. And it is the obligation of the other. Right? How does dust accumulate? Dust accumulates from the atmosphere. It's not something that's put upon you direct. You live there, you grew up in, X place. It's this cultural reality in the air that settles on you and weighs you down. And we have an obligation to shake that dust off of the other by treating them like kings. Avodah Rabahi, and he says this is a big lot of work. To reveal these hidden things in the other. Rakamon Pidgog, it's only the great pedagogue who could reveal hidden things like this. It's interesting that he chooses, I think it means pedagogue. Why does he choose pedagogue? It means a teacher, right? Is he talking about therapy? Is he talking about, it's an interesting question, by the way, living when he lived, a little bit early, does he know anything about psychoanalysis? We know that the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe was a patient of Freud's. He was analyzed by Freud in Vienna. And we have notes in Yiddish that he kept. So it certainly made its way into the Jewish world, but that's a little bit later. So what is this? Is he talking about having to educate the person? If it's a way of educating, it's educating by treating them like a king. Shehema lif'amim, this reminds us also a little bit. There's a little bit of the story of Hillel running before the horse, but that was a rich man who had become poor, and you're obligated to give them what they're used to. But here, this is a poor person who's always been poor, a person who has suffered trauma of generations, but their soul is what creates the obligation. And he says this can be intergenerational inherited difficulty. But one who sees the other as they truly are, and they treat them according to the greatness that they really deserve. There is no limit to that chesed that the other person's soul requires of us, claims upon us, obligates us in. So this is on a practical level, this might scare you away from, having people for Shabbos meals. I don't know. What does it mean to live in this, in a certain sense, he's painting a picture that isn't doable, right? I mean, what does it mean? Maybe you can feel this way about us. Maybe that's vital. I don't know. If you're really going to treat everybody this way, there's not going to be enough to go around, right? But maybe even if it's not, maybe halakha kicks in on a practical level, and you give 1/5, then you give what's normal, and you give. We have a lot of halakhas, we have a lot of Jewish law about what you're obligated to give to the poor. They have to have 2 meals. They have to have, from this kind of fund and that kind of fund. So there's a halakhic level to living our life, right? But he's saying on a Mussar level, right? And they both maybe coexist. And I don't think it means that you have to, spend all of your money on every poor person. I mean, that wouldn't work. So I think the halachic level will kick in in a practical way, but it doesn't free us from Mussar understanding here of how to think about and how to feel about others. Got some questions here. I wanted to take a look at came across this line from Rabbi Berman. I think this was in a podcast actually during Black Lives Matter. They took the cumulative effect of 1,000 indignities, and right, we sometimes that's the author's talking about that also. In other words, you can have subtle. I'm not by my nature somebody who always buys these things, but that's what I think the author's talking about, is this sort of world of microaggressions. Again, I'm a little bit wary of even the term, but the this idea that you can live in a world in which you're being impacted in ways that you don't see, and that gives you pain, right? That is sort of what we mean, by the thousands of indignities that people can inherit. So this was a short piece from Thich Nhat Hanh. He I can't remember why I was reading this. I think he died about a year or two ago. And when he died, I started reading this book. And that was when I put this in here. And it felt relevant to it. Any thoughts before we do this? I mean, does this feel kind of too much? Does it resonate? Does it seem way too beyond halacha? Does it seem too undoable? Does it seem relevant? What other questions did I have? I have a few questions here.
I think all of it.
Yeah. What?
I think it feels all of that, but also overwhelming in that and it feels like it relates to the paraduma in some way as well, of what it means to receive someone and recognize the tumat mate, and how that affects the therapist, I guess, and that's just where the boundaries are with that, and how we can recognize it without absorbing it, I guess, is one of the things I struggle with in this work. But I mean,
Right.
it's both incredibly encouraging and incredibly overwhelming at the same time.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, the paraduma, right? Of course, that's this week, but the paraduma, in the process of making somebody pure, you become impure. And that's very interesting. Are you out right there? There's a difference of opinion sort of among, people in the religious world. To what extent should you get involved with other Jews, right? Should you try and be good? Should you teach Jews who don't know very much? Should you go to places where there isn't much Judaism? You're going to become, quote, impure. Well, or no, or maybe that's precisely what you're supposed to do, right? That's why is it that, God, who made all these rules, like, as the Gemara says, there's no reason for Tum Tara. It's just a decree of the king, so why does the Torah have a sense that the one who purifies becomes impure? That's interesting. Right now, that would, in this context, it would ask the question of, to what extent do I have to compromise my own security? Does this obligate me to give a lot more tzedakah than I would have given? What does it mean how do I even tune into the pain of the other? Is that even possible?
So, hi.
Hey, Phil.
Hyim Shafner, how are you?
Good to have you, man.
It's beautiful and very, very inspiring. And I guess the question is, as you brought up, is how far to take this, how far to take what the author is talking about, how far to apply it. The examples he brings, obviously, in the Gemara is Jews is talking, both the Poalim and the Balabait are all Jews, and I think there's always this every time there's an attempt to take texts like these and to apply them to to the larger community outside the Jewish world, there's this backlash that says that's ridiculous. You can see this is only talking about he's only talking about Jews here, and so I guess I'd love to hear your thoughts just on sort of just what What is there anything in the text, particularly in the first paragraph, before he gets to the Gemara, that gives you, a sense of what that this might be talking to a broader audience, but then I also, how do we address this backlash of people talking about of the ability of the, how do we use texts that talk about Jews, Jews in vis-a-vis Jews, and applying that to a broader context.
Yeah. Well, I will say that the first paragraph, it's true. The second paragraph, he quotes the Gemara, which is talking about Bnei Avram Yitzchak Yaakov. But the first and maybe everybody has their own Avram Yitzchak Yaakov, I don't know. But the first paragraph seems to me to be talking specifically. I think you could even read it as talking about non-Jews specifically, right? Because are the Jews the one with the the cultural inherited the sviva that they don't recognize and the inherited trauma they don't recognize? Is that us? I mean, I don't. My first glance at this was that he isn't talking about us. He's talking about someone else. He doesn't seem. He certainly doesn't mention the word Jewish or Torah or anything. Doesn't mention Yaakov. Like, who is he talking about? Is a great question. Right? He sees Kol Ish Yisrael Chayav L'Hargishota. The obligation is on the Jew. Maybe he doesn't. I don't know. Does he think other people are not capable of tuning into the unconscious pain that people have? Maybe only Jews can do that. But he doesn't say anything about the people feeling the pain being Jews.
So I've got a question, but I see Mona's got her hand up. So Mona, if you want to jump in first.
Yeah.
Sure. This is, again, very powerful. I think that we have a tendency to protect ourselves from the pain of others, including others who are different from us. And this is really a corrective text as I read it, that we do need to attend in that way. Now, the question was raised earlier by someone about therapy, but in general, I would say the question is that you can get so overwhelmed with the deep pain of the other that they're not even able to articulate, that you just fall apart yourself. And of course, there's this well-known phenomenon of therapists. I forget the technical term for it, but it's basically we get injured by witnessing too much pain. And so we need to have our own boundaries. I'm thinking about Martin Buber in two ways here. Buber talks about the I-thou relationship in which the person swings boldly into the experience of the other. And then Buber says in his own more poetic language, but without losing ourselves in the process. Buber is attuned to the boundary that's crucial in order for us to swing into the experience of the other. And the other Buber quote that I'm thinking about is when Buber talks about pedagogy, he talks about the teacher who looks at the student, and just over the student's head, he can see who that student could become. And then Buber facilitates that development of that student, which I think is also really interesting, so that the teacher can see what the student may not be able to see. Although again, there could be damage in that if the teacher is projecting stuff onto the student. But that whole notion of how do we boldly go into places of pain of the other without collapsing or overwhelming ourselves, or without being arrogant and insensitive to the fact that we're projecting onto others, I think is really relevant to this discussion.
Yeah. Well, if there's no I, there's also no thou.
Right.
If you lose the I. Interesting. I wonder if I do in my own mind wonder who he could have read, who he did read. Could he have read Buber? Now, it's hard to know when exactly each of these pieces was written. I don't think we know. But it's possible, certainly, if this had been written. When was I and Thou written? It was like
1923.
Yeah, so I don't know. The ideas are certainly floating around before that's what's out there in the world. Certainly, Freud is already doing work. Yeah, that's a good question. To what extent? It's funny for me. I don't know. I just I don't find often that I'm, unless I'm sitting with a patient, I don't find that I'm able, I don't know, the person on the street, the person in need. I mean, I can, a homeless person, I can talk to them and I can serve them lunch and I can give them some money, but and I can be attentive. Well, the regular folks, I don't know. Can I attend to the unconscious pain that they feel? I don't know if I can do that. I don't know. I don't think I don't even know how. Although I'm very glad that there's a person who looks like this that says it. That's what I'm not sure we can do this, but the idea that the alter said this and he has a long beard and he's from Europe, I think that's great. That sounds crazy, but it's like the idea that this exists in Judaism, I think very important. But I don't know, right? This is not the halacha, because I don't know, when do we do this? How do we do this? Where does it come into play? Maybe it doesn't come into play with every person we meet. Maybe there's one person, I guess there are times, right, when we are kind. You know what I find in a communal context, there are certain times there are people who are difficult, and they will often get ignored in a community because they're difficult. But a smart, person or a smart rabbi knows that they're difficult because of pain that they experience inside. And therefore you go out of your way, even though they're not the easiest people to be nice to, you go out of your way to be nice to them and to include them. And it feels like an act of chesed. But they can't necessarily articulate that because they have defenses and they but that what they need is not to be rejected. What they need is to be included. Precisely because of the difficulties that they have probably faced and can't articulate, and that itself is what probably keeps them from having the most robust social lives. So I think it does play itself out in many communities. If a community can train itself culturally to really be welcoming, not just in word but in practice, it can attend. Not always consciously, but it can, as a community, my community in St. Louis was like this, it can, as a community, attend to those who have no place, because it's a place that is attuned to people's pain.
Rav Hyim, it's so interesting to bring up intergenerational pain and cultural hurt in a social justice context, in a Mussar context, because I'm so used to engaging it through kind of the personal healing sense, the communal healing sense. And in thinking about those two dimensions, the side of kind of the ethical towards the other and the personal and communal in terms of healing, I feel like the latter has really kind of dominated that space. And I would never dismiss that in terms of creating a culture of entitlement or kind of a self-absorption, kind of an obsession with personal and collective healing. But I do just wonder which ought to be more primary, in this conversation. And the easy answer was, well, both, and they're connected because my own
the cultural or the individual
to being, my own personal and collective healing, and this kind of Mussar ethical response to the other. But that feels a little bit overly demanding. And I wonder, what do we want to put on the forefront? Is it that we all have intergenerational pain and cultural hurt and have an imperative to work through that, lest we burn others through it? Or is it more really starting with the other instead of the self, and that we need to be in that societal realm where we are, immersed in responding to others? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. And what does it mean on a practical level? Does it mean, I don't know, does it mean reparations for African Americans? Does it mean a one-state solution in Israel in which it's not a Jewish state? Does it mean, what does it mean? I don't know. This could be taken very far.
But I also wonder, is there a risk of diminishing the agency of the other by being like, I'm not talking to a reasonable person. I'm talking by someone driven by their unconscious hurts. And you can't even have a conversation with this person. Everything's going to trigger them based on unconscious hurts. What's the point where we move this person from a reasonable person of agency into some just ball of mess who doesn't even know what they're saying or doing?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I guess relevant to that is a question of what would the alter say about halacha? Would the alter say, you're not obligated to do this? We have halacha. We know how much tzedakah to give. We know what our obligations are. This has to coexist with that, but or I don't know, or is this just for individuals, or is this once in a while, or I don't know. But yeah, if all we had was Mussar, I don't think you could live that life. The halacha gives us, I guess. But together, right, these kinds of ideas, along with halacha, you can live a practical life, but also infuse it with a certain kind of depth.
I'd
It's
like to
interesting.
address
Yeah.
what Shmuley asked, if it's okay,
Please.
about the self-healing or community healing versus being there for the other. I think they're very much intertwined. I think when we're carrying old intergenerational wounds that have not been healed, we're more likely to do damage to the other in the form of revenge, et cetera. And we don't have to look far these days to see what's going on. But I would say one of the books that's very beautiful on this topic, and I think, Shmuley, you hosted her, is Tirza Firestone's Wounds into Wisdom, where she looks at healing intergenerational trauma in a way that doesn't lead to revenge for other people, but really allows for opening the soul. And when you do heal your own wounds in a way that opens you to the other, I think that's real healing.
Hmm.
So I don't think it's either or. I think they're connected.
Interesting. I mean, I wonder if there's a way that, that the Altar's saying you tune into their pain. He's saying that that creates an obligation on you, but I guess you could say, right, the pedagogical side, which he mentions, is interesting. Is there a kind of education that we do for others and then they run with the ball? Yeah. All right. Well, I'll finish with this piece. This is a meditation on compassion. Love is a mind that brings peace, joy, and happiness to another person. Compassion is a mind that removes the suffering that is present in the other. We all have seeds of love and compassion in our minds, and we can develop these fine, wonderful sources of energy. We can nurture the unconditional love that does not expect anything in return, therefore does not lead to anxiety and sorrow. It's a non-transactional love. Now, obviously, he's not talking about the Torah commanding it. He's talking about you can find it in yourself. The Altar didn't seem to think you could find it in yourself. He thinks you need the Torah for that. The essence of love and compassion is understanding, the ability to recognize the physical, material, and psychological suffering of others, to put ourselves inside the skin of the other, stand in the other's place. We go inside their body, feelings, and mental formations and witness for ourselves their suffering. So that's interesting. Shallow, right, notes you will feel their pain and therefore address it. Shallow observation as an outsider is not enough to see their suffering. How do you feel the pain of the other? You must become one with the object of our observation. Obviously, you only see them from the outside, but he says, no, you could do more than that. You could tune into it. When we are in contact with another suffering, a feeling of compassion is born in us. This is a little bit what Mom was speaking of before. Compassion literally means to suffer with. We begin by choosing as the object of our meditation someone who's undergoing physical or material suffering, someone who's weak or ill, poor, oppressed, has no protection. This kind of suffering is easy for us to see. After that, we can practice being in contact with more subtle forms of suffering. Sometimes the other person does not seem to be suffering at all, but we may notice that he has sorrows which have left their marks in hidden ways. This is the same idea as the Altar. People with more than enough material comforts also suffer. We look deeply at the person who is the object of our meditation on compassion, both during sitting meditation and when you're actually in contact with them, right? So part of this isn't even happening with the other person. We must allow enough time to be really in deep contact with the suffering, to observe him until the compassion arises and penetrates our being. So he has a practical way of kind of doing this. And obviously believes that you can totally feel the pain of the other through meditation on themselves with compassion. And it sounds like part of this practice isn't even with the other person. And that's an interesting meditation to do. Pick somebody and meditate on their pain. Not as good as watching Netflix, but
It reminds me of Rabbi Nachman's looking at the good points and actualizing those without even interacting with the person.
Yeah, that's right. Od ma'at ve'ein rasha. By judging them favorably changes them. Rabbi Nachman says, yeah.
I keep thinking in my mind, in the beginning when you talked about like stepping in and feeling folks, I wonder if like that's moving us from sympathy to empathy, and where we're like moving past just like feeling sympathy for somebody, but truly feeling empathy for the situations of other folks. I'm
Mhm.
really holding that in.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, maybe you begin from one place and you deep into another place. He would say you can use meditation for that. Focusing in on it will do it. Why? Because you are also human. You know what it means to feel those things. Well, thank you all. I have not figured out how to really, integrate this into one's everyday life. But I think, knowing it and going back to it periodically can help. And maybe this idea of meditating on it can be helpful.
Beautiful. Rav Chaim, thank you so much for this deep Torah and a lot to think about and wrestle with here.
Pleasure.
As we think about intertwining our work of therapy with Mussar, with social justice, and living in a messy world that we're all trying to navigate and bring healing to. So this is very powerful. Thank you all so much for joining us, and many blessings as we
Thanks for having me.
lead towards Pesach and work towards redemption together. God bless.
Amen. Have a good
Yeah.
Shabbat.
Thank you all.